Number 1. The USS Trepang Photographs. Picture a nuclear attack submarine holding still beneath the Arctic ice. The water around it is the color of old glass. Somewhere above, the ice groans and shifts. And through the periscope, a camera clicks. The boat is the USS Trepang, a Sturgeon-class attack submarine commissioned in 1970. She was built by Electric Boat, and she spent her life in the cold seas of the North Atlantic. According to the story, in March of 1971, she was running near the ice edge between Iceland and the island of Jan Mayen, and that is where the photographs come from. The images did not appear for decades. They surfaced around 2015, published in a French magazine, and credited to a claimed officer aboard the boat. The most famous frames show a smooth, dark shape near the surface, wedged among the floes. It looks almost teardrop-shaped. It has no visible texture, no obvious ice ridges, nothing that reads as an ordinary berg. To some eyes, it looks manufactured. That is the hook. That is why the pictures will not go away. But look at the rest of the set, and the mystery gets complicated. The same series shows a plain iceberg. It shows a distant ship. It even shows what appears to be a bird crossing the lens. Skeptics say that tells you everything. A periscope camera in low Arctic light will turn a floating slab of ice into something strange. Ice keels, glare, and the flat gray sea all conspire to fool the eye. And with no reference object in open water, you cannot even judge how big the thing is. It helps to know the setting was genuinely plausible. Under ice operations were a real part of Cold War submarine work. American boats regularly ran beneath the pack during exercises, practicing a maneuver called a polinia surfacing, where a submarine noses up through a gap in the ice. The Sturgeon class displaced roughly 4,200 tons submerged. Its periscopes carried camera mounts as standard equipment. So a boat like the Trepang, drifting among floes with a camera running, is not far-fetched at all. Here's the deeper problem. No official declog has been released that ties these photographs to a real patrol. The chain of custody is thin. They came from a magazine, decades later, not from a records request or a naval archive, and the Trepang carried a crew of about 100, which means if this were real, there should be many witnesses. Instead, there is a single attributed name. The set only reached a wide audience because it rode the wave of public interest in unidentified phenomena that swelled through the 2010s. So we are left with three ways to read it. The mainstream view says iceberg and optical artifact. The archival view says a misattributed or stage photo set. And the fringe view says a genuine submerged object was shadowing a Cold War boat under the ice. The Trepang was retired in 1999, and no inquiry was ever opened. Which means the next case has to raise the bar, because eyes in film can be fooled. So what happens when the witness is a machine? Number 2. The Chilean Navy helicopter object. On November 11, 2014, a Chilean Navy helicopter was flying a patrol over the Pacific. The aircraft carried a high-grade infrared camera, the kind used to track ships and coastlines in the dark. The crew was a seasoned Navy pilot and a technician operating the camera. And for roughly 9 to 10 minutes, they filmed something they could not name. On the thermal image, the object shows as a bright, warm shape against a cooler sky. Twice, it ejected a hot plume, a sudden burst of heat that trailed behind it. That detail is what makes the footage famous. The object stayed on the infrared camera the whole time. But it did not appear on the helicopter's radar, and according to the crew, it did not appear on ground radar either. Warm to one sensor, invisible to another. This case did not vanish into a forum. It was investigated by Chile's official body for anomalous aerial phenomena, known by its Spanish initials as CEFAA. The study ran for about 2 years under a retired general, and the government released it publicly in 2017. That is unusual. Most footage like this comes from amateurs. This came with a professional crew, calibrated equipment, and a paper trail. The investigators weighed the ordinary answers: a distant aircraft, a drone, a weather balloon, space debris. The strongest skeptical explanation is that the object was a faraway airliner, and that the two hot plumes were simply engine contrails, condensation trails seen through a thermal lens. In that reading, the craft is a passenger jet miles away, and the mystery is a trick of distance and heat. Supporters push back on the radar question. If it was a large airliner, why did radar miss it? Skeptics answer that infrared can catch a warm object at an angle, and range, where radar returns nothing. There is a reason this footage carries weight. The estimates of the object's altitude and speed were disputed because they all depended on how far away you assumed it was. Change the distance, and a fast nearby craft becomes a slow airliner far off. The case featured in international media in 2017, and it is often paired with the American Navy infrared videos as another example of a professional crew filming something they could not name. Chile's willingness to release it in full stands in sharp contrast to the secrecy of most governments. The honest limit is the footage itself. It is thermal only. It shows heat, not shape. You cannot read fine detail on a warm blob. So the three readings sit side by side. 1. A distant airliner with contrails glowing in infrared. 2. A simple detection mismatch where one sensor sees and another does not. 3. A genuine unidentified craft moving over the sea. CEFAA never reached a final identification. And that raises the next question. If a sensor can mislead us, what happens when the sensor helps start a war? Number 3. The Gulf of Tonkin sonar spooks. Some anomalies are quiet. This one changed history. In early August of 1964, 2 American destroyers were operating in the Gulf of Tonkin off Vietnam. They were the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy. There were 2 reported engagements. The first on August 2nd was real. The second, on the night of August 4th, is the one that haunts the record. That night, the sea was rough, the sky was dark, and the crews believed they were under attack. Sonar and radar lit up with contacts. The men logged more than 20 torpedoes in the water. They fired hundreds of rounds into the night at boats they could not see. But when it was over, there was nothing. No wreckage, no enemy craft, no visual confirmation that anyone had attacked them at all. The on-scene commander, Captain John Herrick, felt the doubt almost immediately. Within hours, he sent a cable urging a complete evaluation before anyone acted on the reports. He blamed, in his words, freak weather effects on the radar and overeager sonar operators. And that is very likely what happened. In a storm, a ship's own wake and propellers can echo back as targets. Warm and cold layers in the water, called thermoclines, can bend sound and create ghost contacts at false ranges. An inexperienced sonar operator, primed to expect torpedoes, will find them. But the doubt did not stop the machine of history. The reported attack helped justify the Gulf of Tonkin resolution on August 7, 1964, which opened the door to a far larger war. Decades later, in 2005, a declassified study by a National Security Agency historian concluded plainly that no attack occurred on the night of August 4th, and that the intelligence had been misread and misused. So the Tonkin spooks are now a textbook case. Reverberation, scattering layers, self-noise, all read as an enemy that was never there. Even the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, later voiced his doubts. The stormy weather that night with a low ceiling and heavy seas degraded the radar and made visual confirmation nearly impossible. And the Turner Joy's own gunfire threw up splashes that the crews may have read as the wakes of torpedoes racing toward them. Sonar instructors still use this night as a warning about acoustic false positives. The whole affair sits preserved in deck logs, message traffic, and government files. 3 readings survive. 1. Ordinary sonar and radar artifacts plus human error. 2. Ambiguous data deliberately used to escalate. 3. That something genuinely moved in the water that night. From a sound with no source, we turn now to an image with far too much history. Number 4. The Trindade Island photographs. Far out in the South Atlantic, about 1,200 kilometers east of the Brazilian coast, there is a jagged volcanic island called Trindade. In 1958, the Brazilian Navy kept a base there, and anchored offshore sat a training and survey ship, the Almirante Saldanha. On January 16, 1958, as the ship prepared to leave, a photographer aboard named Almiro Baraúna raised his camera and captured a sequence of images that people still argue about today. The photographs show a Saturn-shaped object, a disk with a domed top, hanging near the island's highest peak. Baraúna took 6 exposures, and 4 came out usable. Crew members and passengers said they saw it too. The negatives were reportedly developed right there on the ship, under observation, which supporters say rules out a darkroom trick. The Navy investigated, and by some accounts, the Brazilian president himself, Juscelino Kubitschek, stood behind the photos before they were released. That would be a strong case, except for the man who took the pictures. Skeptical researchers later pointed out that Baraúna had a documented history of trick photography. He had even produced a staged article about a sea monster before this. Critics studied the frames and argued that the lighting and shadows do not match, a sign of a double exposure or a small model. And the shape itself, a Saturn with a dome, matches the flying saucer imagery that filled magazines in the 1950s. Still, the pictures endure. Baraúna defended them for the rest of his life. The remoteness of the island, the naval setting, and the sheer number of claimed witnesses keep the case alive. The images are black and white, distant, and low in resolution, so modern digital analysis has been inconclusive. Advocates and debunkers look at the same grain and see different things. It happened during the International Geophysical Year, the great worldwide science campaign of 1957 and 1958, when researchers swarmed remote places like Trindade, which adds an odd layer of context. The case is often compared to another classic from that era, a set of saucer photographs taken over a farm in Oregon in 1950, and it sits in the Brazilian records as one of the most scrutinized ship witness sightings ever filed. 3 readings again. 1. A skilled photographer's hoax or a double exposure. 2. A genuine unknown witnessed by a national navy. 3. A craft over a remote outpost. The Navy's original endorsement is still debated. From grainy 1950s film, we jump forward to sensors so advanced that even the Pentagon had to answer for them. Number 5. The USS Theodore Roosevelt encounters. This is the modern benchmark. Between 2014 and 2015, Navy fighter crews flying from the Theodore Roosevelt carrier group reported strange objects almost every day. They were training over the Atlantic warning areas off the eastern United States, and their targeting cameras caught 2 of the most discussed clips in the field, known as gimbal and go fast. What sets this case apart is the paper trail. The Pentagon publicly acknowledged the videos as authentic in April of 2020. Named pilots went on the record. Lieutenant Ryan Graves and Lieutenant Danny Acoin described objects with no visible engines and no exhaust, holding position for long stretches and moving against strong high-altitude winds. The objects were tracked on the advanced radar of the FA-18 as well as on infrared. But even here, the artifacts fight back. In the gimbal video, the object appears to rotate. Skeptics, including the analyst Mick West, argue that the rotation is not the object at all. It is glare inside a gimbaled camera as the pod tracks and locks. In the Go Fast video, the object seems to race low over the ocean. Careful analysis of the parallax suggests it may be a slow, fairly ordinary object that only looks fast because of the camera's geometry. The same footage that thrills one viewer resolves cleanly for another. The consequences were real regardless. These encounters fed the 2017 reporting that revealed a secret Pentagon program. The Navy formalized how pilots report such sightings in 2019, so the encounters now enter official records. A government review in 2021 looked at 144 incidents and could explain only one of them. Ryan Graves testified to Congress in July of 2023, framing the objects as a flight safety risk, not a curiosity. And crucially for us, these objects operated over open ocean, and pilots sometimes watched them descend toward the sea. The upgraded radar on these jets was a modern active array, far more capable than the sets of a generation earlier, which is part of why the crews trusted what they were seeing. Pilots described objects that stayed aloft for hours with no wings, no exhaust, and no obvious way to generate lift, holding steady in winds that should have swept them away. 3 readings hold. 1. Sensor artifacts, balloons, and distant jets. 2. Parallax and gimbal geometry misread. 3. An advanced unknown craft over Navy ranges. A new office was created in 2022 to run these cases down. Now, pull back from one ship all the way to a fleet sent to the bottom of the world. Number 6. Operation Highjump. Sometimes the anomaly is not a light or a sound. It is the scale of the thing itself. In the summer of 1946 and into 1947, the United States Navy sent an enormous force to Antarctica. It was officially Task Force 68. It carried about 4,700 personnel, 13 ships, and a fleet of aircraft. Rear Admiral Richard Cruzen commanded it, and the famous polar aviator Rear Admiral Richard Byrd was the officer in charge. The stated goals were practical: train people for cold weather war, build a base called Little America 4, map the coastline from the air. And on those terms, it succeeded, photographing vast stretches of unknown coast. But the expedition also carried a tragedy. On December the 30th, 1946, a seaplane crashed, killing 3 men. The survivors were not rescued for days, and the whole operation wrapped up after only about 8 weeks earlier than some had planned. That early exit is the seed of the legend. Fringe stories grew around Highjump for decades, tales of a hidden Nazi base in the ice, a fabricated diary supposedly written by Bird, a famous quote in which Bird seems to warn of enemy craft that could fly from pole to pole. But that quote is distorted. It came from a real interview about the future of polar defense and long-range aircraft, not about a battle with saucers. There is no record of combat, no record of losses beyond that seaplane crash. The real backdrop is far more grounded and still fascinating. This was the dawn of the Cold War, when military planners suddenly cared about the poles as the shortest routes for bombers and soon, missiles. Highjump's mapping was genuine, and a follow-up expedition the next year, sometimes called Operation Windmill, went back to confirm the aerial survey on the ground. Bird himself was already a legend, a man whose earlier polar flights had made him famous, which only sharpened the public appetite for a hidden story. Historians attribute the early departure to brutal weather, thickening ice, and the limits of the equipment, not to any battle. It remains to this day the largest single expedition ever sent to Antarctica. So the readings line up. 1. A training and mapping mission cut short by weather. 2. An early Cold War reconnaissance of the poles. 3. A secret battle with hidden bases or craft. It remains the largest single expedition ever mounted to Antarctica. Its dull, well-documented records are mined again and again for a mystery they do not contain. From a fleet's paperwork, we move to a single case where film and radar agreed over the sea. Number 7. The Kaikōura Lights. In December of 1978, off the northeast coast of New Zealand's South Island, air crews began reporting lights over the ocean near a town called Kaikōura. The crews flew small cargo planes for a regional freight airline. On the night of December 31st, one of those flights carried an Australian television crew who filmed the lights on color movie film. That footage is rare and important because so few radar visual cases over the sea are ever caught on camera. What makes Kaikōura strong is that the lights were not just seen. They were tracked on radar, both on the aircraft's own set and by air traffic control on the ground in Wellington. Some of the returns were described as the size of a large ship, and they moved erratically. The captain, Bill Startup, and his first officer were experienced pilots. They watched the lights pulse, brighten, and pace the plane. On film, the objects glow and flicker over the black water. Then come the ordinary answers, and they are serious ones. The astronomer Carl Sagan favored a simple pair of explanations: the bright planet Venus, low on the horizon, for the visual lights, and the lamps of a Japanese squid fishing fleet reflecting off cloud and water for the rest. Squid boats really do work those waters, and their lights are genuinely dazzling. As for the radar, unusual conditions over the ocean can duck signals and create false echoes, sometimes called angel echoes. Supporters answer that Venus does not appear on radar and that some of the returns tracked with the aircraft's own movements. There's a real mechanism behind the radar side of the debate. Over the ocean, a temperature inversion, warm air resting on cool water, can bend a radar beam and generate false echoes that drift and vanish. The New Zealand government and Air Force reviewed the case. Their report leaned toward the conventional explanations, but it left some radar returns unexplained. And that is the pattern. No single answer accounts for every light, every echo, and every frame of film to everyone's satisfaction. What makes Kaikōura so durable is that it combined 3 kinds of evidence at once: ground radar, airborne radar, and professional color film, which almost never happens together. 3 readings once more. 1. Venus and squid boats and radar propagation. 2. A run of multi-sensor coincidences read as one event. 3. A genuine unidentified craft over the sea. It stands as one of the best documented radar visual cases of the 20th century. Now rewind further to the first war in which trained crews logged glowing orbs over the ocean. Number 8. The Foo Fighters. Long before the words flying saucer entered the language, pilots had another name for the lights that chased them. They called them Foo Fighters. The term came from a comic strip catchphrase, where there's foo, there's fire, and it was picked up by a radar operator in a night fighter squadron. During 1944 and 1945, Allied crews across Europe and the Pacific reported glowing balls of light that flew alongside their aircraft. The best documented reports came from a night fighter squadron operating over Europe, but the Pacific gave its own accounts of amber and red spheres flying in formation over the open sea. The orbs would appear, pace an aircraft for a minute or more, then simply vanish. What is striking is what they did not do. They never fired. No plane was ever lost to them. They behaved less like weapons and more like curious sparks. At the time, military intelligence took them seriously and feared they were a secret German device. After the war, investigators looked back at the reports as a baseline for the whole subject. But no wreckage was ever found, and no device was ever recovered. So, the ordinary explanations took hold. The leading candidate is a real electrical effect called St. Elmo's fire, a glowing plasma that can form on wingtips and propellers in charged air. Others point to ball lightning, a phenomenon so poorly understood that it remains half a mystery itself, and some reports are surely fatigue and the tricks of a dark cockpit. There is one detail that quietly undoes the secret weapon theory. Crews on both sides of the war, Axis and Allied, reported similar lights. A weapon meant to frighten the enemy does not follow its own pilots too. St. Elmo's fire is worth pausing on, because it is entirely real. In a strongly charged sky, a glowing corona of plasma can form on the sharp edges of an aircraft, on wingtips and propeller arcs, and it can pulse and dance in exactly the way crews described. Ball lightning, the other candidate, is real too, but so poorly understood that invoking it trades one mystery for another. So the Foo Fighters sit in the record as the oldest systematic data set we have, trained observers, consistent reports, no hostility, no proof. 3 readings again. 1. St. Elmo's fire, ball lightning, or misperception. 2. A feared but non-existent secret weapon. 3. An early glimpse of genuinely unidentified craft. They set the stage for everything that followed, and they lead us to a night when an entire city fired into the dark at a target no one could name. Number 9. The Battle of Los Angeles. In the small hours of February 25th, 1942, the city of Los Angeles went to war with the sky. It was only weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Nerves were raw, and just 2 nights earlier, on February 23rd, a Japanese submarine had actually shelled an oil facility up the coast near Santa Barbara. So when radar and reports suggested something over the coast, the response was immediate. Sirens wailed, the city went dark, and the anti-aircraft guns opened up. Over roughly an hour, the coast artillery fired more than 1,400 rounds into the night. Searchlights swung across the sky and converged on slow-moving points of light. The guns hammered away. And when dawn came, there was nothing to show for it. No enemy aircraft were confirmed downed. No bombs had fallen. There was no wreckage of any attacker. What there was, tragically, was damage from falling shrapnel and several deaths from the chaos on the ground. A famous newspaper photograph shows searchlights meeting at a single bright point as if pinning a craft in the sky. But that image was heavily retouched, which was standard practice for newspapers then. And it is often shown today as if it were untouched proof. Within a day, the Secretary of the Navy called the whole thing a false alarm. The Army later pointed to a weather balloon that had been released that night, combined with what officials called war nerves. A history published in 1983 reached much of the same conclusion. A balloon, jittery gunners, and expectation. It is very likely that the guns lit up their own shell bursts, and that the crews then fired at the glowing smoke they had just created. A real radar contact early on, perhaps that balloon, may have started the panic before it dissolved into confusion. And the recent genuine submarine shelling made a real attack feel entirely plausible. This is the clearest lesson in the whole list about how mass expectation shapes perception. Thousands of frightened people, primed for an attack that had almost happened days before, turned an ambiguous smudge in the searchlights into an enemy fleet. The event is preserved in exhaustive detail in military records, newspapers, and an official history written 4 decades later, and still no attacker was ever found. 3 readings hold here too. 1. A weather balloon plus war nerves plus friendly fire. 2. A real reconnaissance aircraft that was never identified. 3. An unknown craft over the coast. No enemy action was ever confirmed. The whole barrage was a response to a stimulus that was never resolved, And that brings us to the most famous naval record of all, one that may be pure legend. Number 10. The Philadelphia Experiment. The story goes like this. In October of 1943, the United States Navy supposedly made a warship vanish. The ship was the destroyer escort USS Eldridge. According to the legend, the Navy wrapped her in a powerful electromagnetic field, and she disappeared from the harbor in Philadelphia, reappeared briefly at Norfolk in Virginia, and then returned. Sailors were said to be driven mad or fused into the steel of the hull. It is the most cinematic tale in this entire list. It is also almost certainly false. Trace it back, and the whole legend rests on one man. In the mid-1950s, a writer using the name Carlos Allende sent letters to an author describing the experiment in vivid detail. Those letters, and a strange annotated copy of a book later sent to the Office of Naval Research, are the source. And the records simply do not support them. The Eldridge's own deck logs place her on shakedown and convoy duty, not sitting in Philadelphia on the dates in question. The ship the legend needs her to meet was not even in the same place at the same time. There is, though, a kernel of real science buried inside the myth. During the war, the Navy worked hard on something called degaussing. That is a genuine process that reduces a ship's magnetic signature, so it will not trigger magnetic mines. In a very narrow sense, degaussing makes a ship invisible, but only to a mine, never to the human eye. It is easy to see how that real technique, half understood and retold, could grow into a story about vanishing ships. No physics supports optical invisibility or teleportation the way the legend describes. Einstein's unified field theory is often invoked, with no documented connection at all. The Office of Naval Research, so central to the myth, did nothing more than receive that strange annotated book. It ran no experiment. The Navy has denied it for decades, and the Eldridge's own crew, at their reunions, denied it too. The ship went on to serve in the Greek Navy, renamed into the 1990s, thoroughly documented all the while. A film in 1984 sealed the myth in popular memory, and the lurid extra details, sailors driven mad or fused into the deck, appear in no record anywhere. 3 readings close our list. 1. A myth built on misunderstood degaussing. 2. A hoax seeded by a single unreliable writer. 3. A suppressed secret physics experiment. The legend survives despite the records that contradict it, which tells you something about why these stories last. Step back from the 10 cases, and a pattern comes into focus. Navies operate the most sensitive sensors ever built, in the harshest and darkest places on Earth. They listen to the deep with sonar, they sweep the sky with radar, they watch the horizon with infrared, and every one of those sensors fails in specific, repeatable ways. That is why so many of these anomalies were born inside official files rather than in someone's backyard. Notice how the same physical culprits keep returning. The thermocline, that bent sound in the Gulf of Tonkin, the scattering layers and angel echoes that muddy sonar and radar, the glare inside a gimbaled camera off the Theodore Roosevelt. The contrails read as plumes over the Pacific. These are not random. They are the fingerprints of instruments meeting an extreme environment, and they explain a large share of what people report. Then there is secrecy. Classification delays release, so records surface warped or decades late. That is exactly why the Trepang photographs and the Trindade images have such weak chains of custody, while the Roosevelt encounters and the Kaikōura Lights come with radar tapes and named crews. Provenance turns out to be the deciding variable across all 10. Add wartime expectation, as in Tonkin in Los Angeles, and trained observers will find the very thing they most fear. There is a second, quieter force at work. Selective quotation. Take a real interview like Bird's remarks about polar defense, or a real technique like degaussing on the Eldridge, and trim it, retell it, and let it drift for a few decades. What comes out the other end is a mystery that the original record never contained. The most stubborn cases are the ones where several independent censors agreed, because those are the hardest to wave away and, frustratingly, also the hardest to prove. The lesson is uncomfortable but clear. A record is proof of a report. It is not proof of an object. To judge any of these cases, you need to understand how the three great sensors deceive us. Start with sonar. Sound does not travel in a straight line through the ocean. It bends as it passes through layers of different temperature. So a target can appear at a range where nothing exists. Reverberation and living scattering layers bounce sound back like a solid wall. A ship even hears its own wake and propellers returning as contacts. And every night, a vast layer of sea life rises toward the surface, creating a false bottom that has fooled sonar operators for generations. Radar has its own illusions. When warm air sits over cool sea, it can conduct a radar beam and produce echoes from empty air. Sea clutter and reflected signals paint phantom returns near the surface. Birds, insects, and drifting debris can appear as slow-moving objects. Infrared is different again. It sees heat, not shape. So a distant jet becomes a featureless warm lozenge, and its contrails become mysterious plumes. Two more effects tie the modern cases together. Glare inside a rotating camera pod can spin and look exactly like an object rotating in the sky. That single artifact sits at the heart of the argument over the gimbal video. And parallax, the way near and far objects seem to move at different speeds, can make a slow, distant thing look fast and low, which is the crux of the debate over the go-fast video. Each sensor answers a different question, so disagreement between them is normal, not sinister. Calibrated military equipment lowers the odds of an artifact. It never removes them. Which is why the honest investigator learns the instrument before trusting the anomaly. Now for the honest part. Strip away every artifact, correct for every bias, and a small residue of cases still refuses to resolve. That government review of 144 modern incidents explained only one. The multi-sensor cases like Kaikōura and the Roosevelt encounters have no single tidy answer that satisfies everyone who studies them, and the cases with broken provenance like the Trepang and Trindade photographs cannot be proven, but they cannot be cleanly disproven either. Part of the difficulty is the ocean itself. When something goes into deep water, there is usually no wreckage to recover, no physical closure. And trained observers keep reporting even when they know the biases they are fighting. The gap between the word unidentified and the word extraordinary is where the whole debate lives. Skeptics and believers will read the same radar tape and reach opposite conclusions. The mature position is simple to say and hard to hold. Unidentified is not a synonym for alien. Some of this residue is surely undiscovered natural phenomena, or human technology we were not cleared to know about. The sky and the sea remain under-monitored even now. Historical cases carry a special kind of frustration because they lack the data to ever be reopened cleanly. We cannot go back and rerun the sonar off Vietnam, or point a modern camera at the sky over Trindade in 1958. The evidence is frozen at the resolution of its era. What the records preserve, in the end, is the question, not the answer. And curiosity, not certainty, is the right response to that. The good news is that the field is finally growing up. In 2022, the United States created a dedicated office to run down anomalies across the air, sea, and space domains. Congressional hearings in 2023 put named pilots on the record under oath. And since 2019, the Navy has used standardized reporting. So encounters go into structured files instead of quiet rumor. The tools are improving too. Modern radar, advanced infrared pods, and networked sensors gather far better data than a periscope camera ever could. Just as important, the framing has changed. When a pilot like Ryan Graves calls these objects a flight safety risk, he moves the conversation from folklore to operations. Scientific projects have begun watching the sky with calibrated instruments, chasing measurements that can be tested and falsified, not just anecdotes to be argued over. Transparency is spreading as well. Chile's open study of its Navy footage is a model, not an exception. Declassification pressure keeps pushing old records into the light, and agencies are slowly getting better at sharing data with one another instead of hoarding it in separate files. And here's the part that matters most for this channel. The ocean is a genuine frontier for this kind of monitoring. Most of what happens in the deep is never watched by anything at all. If real submerged objects exist, then better underwater sensors, arrays that listen and watch continuously, not louder claims, are what will finally catch them. The stakes are practical, safety in the air and at sea, and simple scientific honesty about what we do and do not know. 10 cases and one thread runs through all of them. Navies watching the dark with imperfect eyes and writing down what they thought they saw. The sea, it turns out, preserves machines and secrets far better than it preserves answers. Every record we open tonight is really a snapshot of belief, a moment when trained people were certain, and the evidence was not. The resolved cases teach us humility about perception. Tonkin and Los Angeles remind us how easily fear and instruments together can conjure an enemy from empty water and empty air, and how high the cost of that illusion can climb. The open cases teach us humility about knowledge. Kaikōura and the Roosevelt encounters remind us that even our best sensors sometimes hand us a puzzle with no clean solution. And across every case, Providence decided which anomalies faded and which endured. So where does that leave the investigator, which is what you have been this whole time? Not a believer and not a cynic, just someone who has learned that sensors extend our reach and multiply our illusions in the same breath. The ocean remains the least monitored place on the planet. The next real answer will come from better data, not better stories. Navy records will keep surfacing, warped by time and secrecy, each one a little snapshot of the dark. Because the deep does not explain itself. It only keeps its records. And it is very good, unnervingly good, at keeping them in the dark.